the company.
Ranking Republican member of that committee, Congressman Darrell, Issa, no stranger to Scoreboard, joins us now. Congressman, good to see you. Thanks very much.
Good to be back on, and as you've been sort of letting your viewers know, it was a very exciting day, not because this is a perfect witness. This is a witness who has some cloud of culpability over his head, but his 35-plus years give him an insight into this company and why we shouldn't have spent $180 billion and counting on it.
Absolutely, but right from the get-go, and you were opposed, if I can, to even bringing this Mr. Greenberg in as a witness. I'm just going to read a short bit of a letter from April 1st that you wrote to the head of the committee saying, I hope you will reconsider allowing Mr. Greenberg to testify, or at the very least join me in publicly acknowledging the veracity of his testimony is questionable. So you really suspect that the guy wasn't capable of telling the truth?
He certainly wasn't. You know, he used terms like more than twice as many credit default swaps occurred after I left the company than while I was there. Well, 43% of them occurred on his watch, and the remaining, almost all of them, occurred in the 3 quarters that followed. So, you know, he would reinterpret history the way he wanted to. No, not unusual for a former CEO.
But Congressman, I got it. Forgive me for interrupting, but we're looking at pictures of him swearing an oath to tell nothing but the truth. Not only did he swear that oath, but so did his attorney, David Boies, who is well known all over the world. You're saying that he committed perjury today?
I'm saying that he reinterprets the facts. You know, he paid a $1.6 billion fine for misconduct on his watch, and yet he says he had all of these systems in place. The fact is he was helpful to us, but I think on both sides of the aisle, we defined him as who he is, which is a person who did a great job of building a huge corporation, probably could have managed it better than the current management, but ultimately left for his misconduct and is still trying to rewrite history for his period through 2005.
But before I leave the question of perjury, is anybody thinking of bringing up charges against Mr. Greenberg for it?
Well, we're certainly going to look at the entire testimony, and we're going to have follow-up witnesses. So I think we'll define what is the truth very carefully before we make allegations. But I think the one thing we did learn today is that when Republicans said we shouldn't have had TARP money that could just be thrown around, he basically told us how foolish it was to have thrown money, actual cash money, into this London-based subsidiary and allow it to be dispersed to European banks when, in fact, it wasn't required that it be dispersed. That was a big part of what we saw today. $40 billion or so of that $180 billion. If we'd used Chapter 11 reorganization, never would have been paid. And oh, by the way, those bonuses could have been renegotiated in a Chapter 11 also.
No, listen, on what to do with AIG, I'm in 100% agreement with you. I think that it should have been in Chapter 11. That's where this thing could have been resolved without us paying off 100% of some of those other parties that were virtually paid off completely for their lousy credit default swap bets. But again, the question of whether everybody was doing what Mr. Greenberg was doing, and of course doing it in a very accelerated fashion after he left AIG.
Well, I think there is some culpability in that he was terminated. They did not cease the buying and bundling of these credit default swaps on subprime loans until roughly 1 full year later. They began cutting it down, but they went 4 full quarters before they ceased the program altogether. And basically 60 or 57% of the credit default swaps were after he left, 43% while he was there. Ultimately, though, combined, it represents the biggest single mistake probably in insurance-related history.
Well, and it's the biggest single amount of money that the TARP funds have had to pay off. As in my last reckoning, a little over $180 billion in order to pay off those bad bets. Is that right?
Absolutely. And he made the point that we, the taxpayer, paid them off at par rather than any kind of a markdown discounted rate that they could have been bought at. He also made a very valid point that I think was a productive part of the hearing, and that was that if he had remained there, he would have hedged the bets. He would have hedged these things. Well, in a sense, that's why he was a better manager. But let's understand, hedging simply causes other people to have those losses when they occur.
That's
the
right.
core culpability here was creating these devices and not having the kind of offset real capital that they deserve to have as an insurance product.
And as to the issue of the haircut that should be taken, I think, by the billionaire hedge funds that were taking out these CDSs, I mean, clearly they had the capacity to look at AIG and realize that it didn't have the funds to back up those CDSs in case the bets went bad, right?
You're absolutely right. They understood that with $80 billion in assets and $80 billion in liabilities, this FP division of AIG, all it took was one filing and it was wiped out. So there was never any question but that was an equity starved corporation that only was reliable if and only if AIG chose to pay for it. So a lot of people knew they were going naked on this insurance, but it was profitable, and that's one of the reasons it chased these high profits and high commissions.
We have some breaking news that I'm sure you'll want to chime in on. The U.S. House of Representatives has approved the Democrats' $3.45 trillion 2010 budget plan. Your initial reaction?
I'm still going to leave this interview and go vote against it. The vote is still open, but you're right. We never had any doubt that the largest budget in American history, and one that makes no effort to narrow the excesses of this government, will pass and will be signed by the president.
What does that mean for the country?
Well, it means that you went too much and lowered your taxes to Democrats who spend too much and raise your taxes. It's that simple.
Well, they say they're not going to do it. They're only going to raise on a small group of people at the top.
You know, one of the hallmarks of this administration is the cap and tax program, or cap and trade as they like to call it. That's a $1 trillion tax increase even before they get into the upfront taxes. But if you look at their budget, you look at how they achieve it, they've got an awful lot of revenue they're looking to get from a relatively small amount of people. I suspect that when they don't get it from the people over $209,000 of income, they will come get it from where they can. But the bottom line is, if they don't curtail spending, all the tax increases in the world will not solve the basic problem, which is the more rocks you put in the knapsack of the American worker, the less productive he is. And taxes are a rock in the knapsack of those who have to carry the load. That's our problem in America. It was a problem begun by Republicans. It is clearly getting worse under Democrats.
Congressman, if you can stay with us for just a moment, I want to switch to Rich Edson, who is our man in the Washington Bureau, standing by. Rich, what can you tell us about this bill?
Well, David, the vote is still technically going on, but it has reached the threshold. The House has approved a budget of $3.5 trillion. House Democrats shaved about $100 billion from what the president had requested. Now, Democrats reduced the president's plan by cutting $250 billion set aside for another bailout just in case, and his tax cuts, they assumed, would expire in 2011. Now, the Congressional Budget Office estimates a deficit of more than $1 trillion next year. But, David, this is a blueprint. Congressional committees will still have to fill in the blanks over the year on specific items like cap and trade you'd heard about, education, and taxes. The Senate is still working through its roster of amendments, expecting a final vote sometime later this evening.
All right.
David,
thank you, Rich Edson, very much. And Darrell, Issa, if you're still there, just want to go over one other piece of business, if we can, which is that there is a bill called the Sanders-Feingold Web Fed Transparency Amendment. This is something that is very near and dear to our hearts here at Fox Business, because, as you know, we are being stonewalled by the Federal Reserve in our attempts to get information from them. Are you a backer of this bill, and do you support our lawsuit?
No. Absolutely. You cannot have the Fed chairman standing next to the president supporting a policy and then have him say that he doesn't need to give you transparency because he's independent. You're absolutely right. I will do everything I can to open up and make that huge obligation of the American people available to the American people.
Very good man to do so. We appreciate your support as well.
Thank you,
Darrell,
David.
Issa, thank you very much. Appreciate you being here.